Welcome to this morning's presentation from Wax Digital. So today we're going to be talking about what you should do, and I guess just as importantly what you shouldn't do, in order to make a P2P implementation as smooth, as painless, and ultimately as successful as possible. The headphones are a good look. It does look a bit like a silent disco in here, so if you do get the urge to get up and dance, please do so at the back of the room, so as to avoid blocking the screen for the rest of the audience. To kick things off, just very quickly, 2 slides about Wax Digital for those of you that aren't that familiar with us. We are a e-procurement provider, obviously, since about 2001, so the last 17 years or so. We've been providing e-procurement solutions to about 250,000 users in somewhere north of 100 countries worldwide. We are a Gartner Magic Quadrant visionary company, so if that means anything to you, we're one of about 14 providers globally that is on the Gartner Magic Quadrant and one of 4 that's in that visionary section. But I guess most importantly to us from this particular slide is that central figure of 98% client retention. That's something that we're really proud of, something that we work very hard to try and maintain by working really in collaboration with our customers for the long term. We are a broad-based suite provider, so we provide the entire suite of what we call source-to-pay software. So that includes all of the upstream, contract management, electronic tendering, auctioning, and of course downstream, so purchase-to-pay, which specifically we're going to be looking at this morning. We're also quite unique in having our own integration platform as a service, Web3 Connect, which I'll come on to in a bit more detail later in the presentation. Okay. So that's the corporate preamble out of the way. Let's get down to the main presentation. And this session isn't really about trying to sell you the concept of purchase to pay. Hopefully you're here because you already buy into the returns and the benefits of a P2P implementation. I think they're pretty well understood, certainly by this kind of audience and vendors like us and analysts or commentators such as Spend Matters also spend a lot of time talking about these kind of benefits, and I've drawn this summary actually from the Spend Matters website. But this session is about making sure that you give yourself and your organisation really the best possible chance of realising those returns by implementing P2P with the lowest possible friction. So, number 1 on the list, make sure you're ready. Naturally, as effectively somebody who stands to benefit from you kicking off a project, my leaning is to say, you've got budget approved. Great, you're good to go. Let's get going. But actually, I'd much rather wait, in truth, and I'd rather wait until you've put the groundwork in place to ensure we both enjoy a successful project. And that starts really by asking 3 questions of yourself and your team. So firstly, to reiterate the main question, I guess, are you actually ready? There aren't necessarily any particular rights or wrongs here. But recognizing the kind of environment in which you're operating and how your team functions and is perceived within that environment should shape how you approach a significant technology project. So a client of ours like Coventry Building Society, for example, it focused on transforming the profile and the reputation of the procurement function from that of kind of a back office administrative team to a highly visible, well-respected department seen as a key business enabler. They worked hard to establish the groundwork for policy and process and then put in a system to actually police and enforce and support that process. WSH, on the other hand, is a different example. It's a food services business client of ours. It's much more about direct spend. So it didn't really have that battle to fight. But it is a huge business, and since we're dealing with direct spend, it's very risk aware. So they started small with electronic invoicing, although they process about 2.1 million invoices a year, so it's not that small, but to get the benefit of one area of the solution deployment and then roll back into the other areas of purchase to pay to support electronic invoicing. So I guess the message here is be self-aware. What building blocks are there that you might need to put in place before you move to a purchase-to-pay implementation. Another key part, I guess, of making sure you're ready is understanding what your current processes are and ideally documenting them if they aren't already documented. You may think you have a clear understanding of the current purchasing process or of approvals rules or whatever it might be, it may seem all very obvious and clear, but actually I can't tell you how many workshops we've run where we found that the sort of the figurative left and right hand of the business are doing very different things when it comes to procurement. And moreover, those two sides of the business both believe that they're doing it correctly in the right way. So do take the time to discuss, to agree, to document your as-is process, and you'll save a lot of time and energy and cost ironing out those differences before you start, rather than subsequently trying to engineer a solution to accommodate them. Another part of making sure you're ready is to understand, hang on, sorry. Finally, you do have to have a vision of what you're trying to achieve. Can you sell that vision to other stakeholders in the organization in such a way that they aren't simply aware of what you're doing, but actually become advocates for what you're doing? So doing a proper job of preparation, working across teams to map out the current processes and the to-be, all actively contributes to winning of hearts and minds and to the ultimate success of a P2P project. A client of ours, Warburton's, did a fantastic job here where they had a small procurement, actually mostly outsourced procurement function. They insourced that, brought it back in-house, spent 2 months prior to implementation with a dedicated, experienced project manager laying the project groundwork. And as a consequence, it was one of the most successful projects we've ever been involved with, because the client was really well prepared, had put the groundwork, the preparation and the detail in place to start with what is a major project. Okay, so number 2 on the list. Something we've already kind of touched on in the preparation stage, setting clear and measurable goals. Now, there are different kinds of goals, I guess. At the somewhat sort of prosaic level, there are simply the requirements. What is it that we want the system to functionally do? And obviously, you need to have a clear picture of this and set that out in some detail in your RFP. But do be careful here, actually, because in the first place, to paraphrase George Bush, you don't know what you don't know. So there might well be a better or a different way of achieving your functional goals if you allow your software vendor to help you shape the solution as you go along. And one thing to be really careful of, I think, is to resist the temptation to focus on the kind of the tiny minority of the most complex scenarios that you actually encounter from a purchasing perspective, wrapping up huge amounts of time and energy and resource in trying to solve issues that actually only affect a tiny proportion of users and transactions. So be prepared to flex from your original requirements, which have typically been documented in isolation and before you've actually engaged in much detail with a solution provider. And never forget what those goals are and effectively why you're implementing this system in the first place. One of the issues can be that by the time a P2P system goes live, there's a danger that kind of project fatigue has set in. The initial objectives are kind of forgotten in the release, almost the relief of project go live. We try and help this by providing a set of very specific project success metrics and reports. So it's a pack that measures things like system adoption, like supplier onboarding progress, transactional throughput, and so forth. So you can clearly evidence the answers to questions like, is the system doing what you wanted it to do, and what you told everybody that it would do, and can you demonstrate those results to all the stakeholders that you've brought along with you? But that is just the start. The big learning here when it comes to setting goals and measuring success is in a P2P project is not to think like an IT project manager where the focus is on effectively a project plan that ends at the point that the solution goes live. You are not IT project managers, you are senior procurement professionals. So you have to think about P2P not as a implementation project, but as a 3 or a 5 or a 10-year program, which the system implementation is only the first phase. So implementation is not an end in itself, it is just the beginning of the process. Now, whilst you don't want to think in quite the same terms as a project manager, therefore, you are a program manager, if you like, where the project concludes with go live or shortly thereafter, I think you do want to have a great project manager on your team that does think just like that. So number 3 in the list is project management. So in most cases, obviously a P2P implementation is a procurement project. It's true that it will have sort of an overarching impact on the rest of the company, including finance and HR, but in most cases procurement have to take on the project ownership and the leadership. And because you have to take on that ownership, your project manager is the most important member of your team. In fact, hands down, I would say the biggest success factor on your side of the table is the quality of your project manager. So my counsel would always be to get the best person you possibly can. Ideally with experience of an e-procurement implementation, and to engage with them on the project a couple of months before you start and actually keep them on that project a couple of months after implementation is complete. Because even once the system is live, you want somebody to manage the deployment with military precision, really, who can tell you exactly how many people have been trained at each site in a 13-site nationwide deployment, as here for one of our clients, for example. And who can tell you how many are left to be mopped up to account for absence or illness and so forth, and what the actual plan is to mop up those remaining users. Who can manage and organize any aligned technology streams, such as, in this case, the decommissioning of the SAP SRM system that we were replacing with our P2P solution. All under the umbrella of a detailed project plan across those various streams, and with a responsibility, again, for seeing through the initial stages of measurement and reporting for those goals and objectives that I was just talking about previously, which hopefully ends up being reported, something like this, and leads to a clear and quantifiable set of KPI measures that demonstrate real value back to the business. So in this particular case, again, real-life client example, reducing retrospective invoicing by 60%, cutting your no-PO invoices by more than half, reducing your one-time supplier spend by 90-odd%, all within a couple of months of go-live. But again, get the project manager to drive that process of understanding the returns and helping you put in place a framework to report on those returns as part of their engagement for the project. So number 4 on the list, stakeholder engagement. Whether it's the managing director, the finance director, the CPO, it is extremely useful to have a board-level representative whose name is publicly pinned to your project. It gives the project legitimacy, it gives it urgency, and ultimately it gives it the brute force, if you like, that's sometimes required to actually push change through an organization. It's also important, may seem blindingly obvious, but nonetheless, that assuming finance isn't the project lead, to get finance and AP fully on board. Not just because they may actually be the ones paying for the solution, although we've seen that shift over the course of the last few years to where these days it's much more likely that the procurement function is actually funding the project themselves rather than through finance. But because of the explicit interaction with their finance system, the coding, the ledgers, the budgets, and so on, it doesn't happen that much anymore, but there certainly used to be occasions when we would go into workshops and it would be just at that point that it actually dawned on finance that this wasn't just a procurement department toy, that this was a system that would actually have a major impact on AP and finance processes. And then finally, the ultimate success of a P2P solution obviously relies very strongly on universal end user adoption. Many of those benefits that I put up at the outset of the presentation stem from compliance and deliver returns on the basis of getting as much as possible of your spend under management, which means getting as many as possible of your employees buying compliantly through the system. Which brings us neatly on to change management, because meeting your clear goals and objectives requires a clear understanding of the current landscape and the change overhead that you're facing. So it's really important to be honest with yourself here and to search out kind of people who've maybe been in the business for a while, if you've not been in the organization for that long, who know the lie of the land better of you perhaps, If you're not familiar with past deployment lessons, what kind of organization are you working within when it comes to IT deployments, change management, and the historical success of those initiatives? Does the organization have a history of resistance to change? Is it a culture that's very used to change and actually has a dedicated change management team that can support you? These kind of things are going to make a significant difference to the way in which you approach change management across the business. And part of that change management process, in here at number 5, is a clear and effective sales program, an internal sales program to start with. Doesn't necessarily require you to go the full Gareth Cheeseman, but it does mean that internal communications has to play an important part in your planning and execution. And part of that is, of course, just effectively cold, hard business facts. What is this going to do for each stakeholder? What is it going to do for their team, their department, their business unit? People want to know, if a change is coming, effectively what's in it for me? Why is it coming? You need to couch that in a way that makes it relevant to the different parts of your ultimate user community, which is typically going to span your entire business. So express the generic business benefits, but also take the time to understand and to address the specifics of each audience you're approaching so that the system becomes effectively alive to them in terms of the benefits. And equally, try to think outside the box a bit, go beyond sort of the cold, hard commercial and process returns and look to create a level of social engagement around the introduction of a new system. So a couple of examples of the way in which we've worked with clients to facilitate that kind of engagement at different stages of the process. These are very simple examples, but they make a big difference. So in the design stages, for example, we often work with our clients and encourage them to do things like run a naming competition across the business for the new system that they're deploying. The system is completely configurable in terms of the way that it's branded, in terms of the way that it looks and feels. So get stakeholders involved early on, actually give them a feeling that they are involved in the design to some extent of this new system that's being implemented. So here you can see these are the names that some of our clients actually give the system that they have in place for them. So Be Smart for Britvic, WeBuy for Weetabix, Panda Purchasing for the World Wildlife Fund. Those kind of things really just help to kind of socialize the introduction of a new technology into a wider business. And then actually during the deployment phase, things like, again, a little bit gimmicky, but actually potentially very effective, a buy now button. It's a USB button, just plugs into your laptop or your PC or what have you. Press that button and it brings up the P2P application immediately. It's a nice way of just socializing, again, that technology within the organization and underlining the core benefit of this is a really easy way to buy compliantly. Press the button, there you go, job done. You can now buy from your approved suppliers at the right prices. Makes it very simple and again underlines that benefit. So these small initiatives can make a big difference when it comes to winning over stakeholders in the business. And by extension, of course, driving adoption and driving return on investment, driving the benefits. Now, of course, the biggest stakeholder community in a P2P implementation actually exists outside of your organization rather than within your organization. It's, the suppliers. So at number 6, we've got supplier engagement. And very often the number of suppliers in your system will be probably 5 to 10 times the number of internal employees that will be using a P2P solution. And it's actually, naturally, very much more difficult to force a change in behavior in suppliers than it is in internal stakeholders. So I guess, again, naturally, working from that, the best way to implement a change program across your supply chain is to limit the scope of that change as much as possible. In other words, to make it as easy as possible for suppliers to actually comply and engage successfully. And actually, that's quite simple to achieve. So the main potential process change for suppliers is invoicing. And we'll typically recommend to clients that they take this transition in stages. So make the first stage as simple as possible, which generally means just getting them to actually email PDF invoices to a new email address. And then we'll take care of extracting the data from those emails automatically and finding a match. Now, the only downside to that is that there is a cost per invoice involved in actually that process. And that cost disappears when you migrate suppliers over to using a supplier portal. At least it does in our particular case. There are obviously vendors that charge suppliers for that. But that is something you can do over time. It's not something that you have to force on day one. There are a lot of other priorities as you're taking a system live that are perhaps more important to you. And it's not necessarily to add that pressure point at that particular time. Take your time. Migrate suppliers in tranches to the supplier portal so that you can reduce that cost of processing and engagement and invoicing day one through email processing, which is much, much more efficient and cost effective than manual paper or OCR processing. And then again, when you move them over to the portal. So you're driving the cost down to small from the outset and through to none at all subsequently. And while I'm talking about this, actually, just a point on supplier portals and networks. There are a number of models out there to choose from. They're point-to-point, hub and spoke, fully connected networks. And vendors like us love to build supplier networks. In some cases, like Ariba or Tungsten, because they earn considerable revenues direct from the suppliers in so doing. In others, simply because actually it adds value to us as a vendor. The size of your overall supplier network actually increases your corporate value. So we are well incentivized to try and grow that supplier network. But ultimately, I don't think you should be fooled by thinking that the scale and nature of a vendor's network is going to materially impact on the success or the speed of supplier adoption. If there was one global super network that you could just plug straight into, then maybe. But actually, suppliers are used to engaging with multiple systems. From us, from Ariba, from Cooper, from Basware, from Taulia, from Tradeshift, from Proactis. The list goes on and on. So suppliers are used to dealing across multiple platforms with different buyers in different ways. And it's not a significant advantage, I don't think, in having in any of those particular network models. Just last month, we finished a 6-month program enabling 4,500 suppliers, 170 of those fully integrated, back office to back office, electronically enabling 2.1 million invoices. All it requires ultimately is proper planning, communication and execution, and good data as well. And talking of which, that brings up my number 7 on the countdown, or the count up. This one's a bit in the weeds, but again, it is really important. Poor data could be an absolute nightmare in a P2P implementation. And a big problem is that it often doesn't have a significant impact until right at the end of the process. So, if you've been through weeks, even months of workshopping, specification, implementation, testing, typically much of the build and test will have been done using a small, anonymized data sample. So it's not until just before you're about to go live and do the final round of testing and cutover that the full data load is actually made to the production system. And it's not a good thing, obviously, to find out at that stage that there are major issues with your data. And don't forget, it's not just about populating spreadsheets of supplier details. The interrelationships between those data points are really important too. They have to work. So a lot of our clients actually undertake a data cleansing activity as either in advance or as part of the implementation process, because it's a good opportunity to do it at that point. It becomes part of your overall project life cycle, but also part of your overall project cost, which can be quite a difficult cost to sell to the business if it's an isolated project that isn't part of a program like this. And of course, get your solution provider to help, with templates, with testing, with validating data quality and integrity through the program, rather than waiting till the end of the program to suddenly find out that you have a data problem. Okay, moving on to number 8, getting there now. I haven't really touched on it too much today, but naturally one of the key success factors is technology. I'm not going to spend much time talking about the different pros and cons of different solution providers. Obviously something of a vested interest in that. But there are a couple of key principles, I think, that it's really important to take ownership of. The first of these is how any vendor's technology profile and roadmap align with your thinking and your ultimate objectives. So some of the key variables here are things like, are you looking for a full suite vendor so that you can grow your solution footprint from one integrated suite over time? Or are you just looking for the best possible fit for whatever your current technology requirement is? the answer to that will have a big impact on whether you even consider working with some of the more silo technology providers here, like Scan Markets and SourceDog, for example. If you prefer a single provider approach, do you value full suite optionality, by which we mean if you've got a full suite, can you choose just one module or a series of modules in isolation from the others to meet your current needs while building in the future to a broader solution? So we offer full suite optionality, for example. A vendor like Cooper doesn't. And then are there any industry or vertical specifics that mean that you should take particular account of vendor experience in your area? Just some of the kind of questions that you should be thinking about. And again, how you answer those is kind of down to your procurement technology architecture plan, your strategic roadmap. What's right for one organization certainly won't necessarily be right for another. But it points again to the fact that even if you're just looking at something quite simple at present, maybe an e-sourcing solution or something like that, it's important to frame your decision-making process in the context of that overall roadmap. And then the other technology point is nothing to do with vendors, really, and everything to do with juggling. Be very conscious of wider IT initiatives that might impact on the success of your project. Almost every organization we talk to today complains about the scarcity of IT resource in their business. It's almost a given these days, when effectively IT is so central to the operations of almost every business. So it's likely for most businesses that the number of IT projects that they're running, the demands on the IT team, have never been higher, which makes it fortunate in one respect that implementing a cloud-based procurement solution places relatively few demands on the IT team, but of course it does need to integrate with your finance system. So if your finance system is changing, if it's subject to any major work in the near future, be aware that that will impact your project. We're working with a global organization currently on a supplier information management program. That totally transforms their supplier onboarding process, their data management, takes it completely electronic, ensures that suppliers are automatically reminded and then put on hold if they don't keep data up to date. It's a brilliant system, I think, but we've been waiting over a year now for an SAP upgrade on their side so that we can seamlessly integrate that with their finance system. So we have a manual data extract and load process in at the current time, which works okay, but obviously try and avoid a situation where other IT projects are really limiting, hampering, in some way impacting on the outcomes of what it is that you're trying to achieve. And when it does come to integration, recognize the boundaries. We place a lot of emphasis on our integration capabilities, on our integration product. And the principle that we take is to make integration as easy as it can be for your IT team. So we serve up data and we consume data however it is that you want to receive it and give it to us. But we are not Oracle, SAP, JD Edwards, Aggresso, whatever consultants. So be clear where the boundaries are drawn. We're currently working right now, in fact, with a client in London. It's not the first time, I'm sure it won't be the last time, but they assume clearly that we can integrate with their ERP system, which we can do, but also that we will do the work within their ERP system to actually enable that integration locally. That is not the case. That is not our remit. It is your finance system. You need to make sure that you are resourcing the integration on your side of things. And importantly, if that support is outsourced to a third party, which obviously a lot of people have, their finance system support outsourced to a service provider, make sure that you speak to them early in the process so that you understand what costs are going to be involved from them, because we have seen real horror stories where this should only take a couple of handfuls of days, but people have been charged or quoted tens of thousands of pounds for doing the integration work on their local finance system because the solution provider or their support partner sees it as an opportunity to gouge for cost when they have nowhere else to go and no other alternative. Okay, so just coming quickly to a close now, my penultimate success factor, be pragmatic. P2P implementations are major projects. This is a big IT initiative. A lot of what I've talked about this morning is ultimately focused on getting the detail right, being meticulous about your planning, about your preparation, about your engagement. A lot of moving parts, and again, that's why, going back to success factor 3, very important to have a great project manager that can handle all those moving parts. But here's the trick too, and again, it comes back to an earlier point about, focusing on adoption rather than adaptation. It is better, it is a more positive outcome to change some of your process and thinking as you go through this journey to fit more closely to industry best practice software principles than to try and reinvent that wheel such that it fits your cart very specifically. Accept there'll be change, be prepared to embrace change, and try not to become blinded to the bigger picture by focusing too intently on, minor issues or features or must-haves that at the end of the day will actually make almost no difference to most of your user community and to the success of the project and the outcomes. What's important, I guess, is being prepared to make some compromises, not on the big stuff, but on the little stuff, to kind of maintain momentum, to deliver the headlines rather than the epitaph for this project. And then finally, final slide, final success factor, courage. The sharper-eyed amongst you might well notice that this word is made up of letters culled from some of the logos of some of the world's most successful companies like Amazon and Google, who've kind of disrupted, reinvented, and ultimately created huge values from challenging the status quo. But while I guess that view from the mountaintop is very fine and amazing, scaling it, we recognize can be challenging, it can be an exhausting process. And there's probably no bigger single project that a procurement team can undertake than the implementation of a P2P system. It is almost certainly going to touch more people in your organization than any other IT investment, including your finance system. So ultimately, is it worth it? Well, it takes courage. It means putting your head above the parapet and championing a very public program of change. But if I was going to sum it up, you do the groundwork, you get the right people in place, you work with a supportive vendor who understands you and your business, and you can transform for the better. Not just business outcomes, compliance, savings, risk reduction, and so on, but actually the everyday purchasing experience of hundreds or even thousands of your colleagues. And certainly I believe that that is a mountain worth climbing. Thank you very much.